The farmer market smelled like cinnamon and wet pavement, the kind of gray Saturday morning where the sky couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. And Benjamin Turner had his daughter's hand gripped tight in his as she pulled him toward a table stacked with honey jars shaped like little bears. He didn't see Charlotte Hayes until Rosie had already let go of him and grabbed her hand instead, small fingers wrapping around long, elegant ones still faintly creased from a week of gripping a pen too hard in board meetings. And for one full second neither adult moved, because neither of them could quite believe who they were looking at. The honey vendor, a heavy-set man with flour on his apron, glanced between the three of them and smiled the easy smile of someone who assumed he already understood the picture in front of him. Young dad, pretty mom, kid who clearly belonged to both. "She's got your eyes," he said to Charlotte, nodding at Rosie, and Charlotte's mouth opened and closed, and Ben felt his stomach drop the way it did in the half-second after missing a step on the stairs. Rosie, delighted, tugged Charlotte's hand toward the next stall, without a trace of doubt in her small body about who this woman was allowed to be. Ben laughed, too fast, too loud, the laugh of a man trying to get ahead of an awkward moment before it could land, and said, "Careful, people might think we're together." Charlotte turned to him. She didn't laugh. She looked at Rosie's hand in hers, and then at him, and something passed behind her eyes that he wouldn't understand for months, and she said, quietly, almost to herself, "Would that be bad? To find out how two people who were never supposed to end up here became the family neither of them saw coming, stay until the very end." 3 years earlier, none of this existed. Not the market, not the ease of Rosie's laugh, not even the version of Ben who could stand in public without flinching at the sound of a woman's voice calling his name. 3 years earlier, Ben Turner had been an entirely different man, married to a woman named Diane, who filled every room she walked into with a kind of unearned confidence that made other people brave just standing near her. And Rosie had been 4 years old and full of the specific ferocious love that small children have for their mothers. Diane died in March on a Tuesday in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and vending machine coffee. An aneurysm that gave no warning and left no time for anyone to say the things people are supposed to get to say. Ben had been at work that day. He remembered that detail more than almost any other. The fact that he had been at his desk, running numbers on a maintenance contract, when his whole life ended 2 miles away without him. After that, he stopped being the kind of person who let anyone close enough to matter. He kept his job as a facilities maintenance supervisor at Hayes Industrial, a mid-size manufacturing and logistics company that made precision components for the aerospace supply chain, because it was steady, because it let him leave by 4:30 most days to pick Rosie up from her after-school program, and because it asked nothing of him emotionally, which was exactly what he needed. He fixed HVAC systems and conveyor lines and the occasional stubborn loading dock door, and he did it quietly, competently, without complaint, and almost nobody at Hayes Industrial knew his name beyond the sign-in sheet. Charlotte Hayes had inherited the company from her father 2 years before that Saturday market encounter, at 36 years old, in the middle of what the board politely called a period of transition, and what Charlotte privately called the worst 18 months of her professional life. Her father had built Hayes Industrial from a single leased warehouse into a 300-employee operation over 4 decades, and when he died of a stroke in his office on a Thursday afternoon, the board had circled Charlotte, like she was a problem to be managed, rather than the person who was supposed to lead them. She had spent 2 years proving herself to men who had known her since she was a child running through the factory floor in patent leather shoes, and the proving had cost her nearly everything soft in her personality. She worked past 9 most nights. She had not taken a real vacation in 3 years. She had, if she was honest with herself in the rare moments she allowed for honesty, almost no life outside the building on Meridian Avenue that bore her family's name, and she had told herself for so long that this was simply what the job required that she had nearly stopped noticing the cost of it. The stakes riding on that particular season were not abstract. Hayes Industrial was 11 weeks from finalizing a 7-year supply contract with a major aerospace manufacturer, a deal worth just over $40 million over its life, and, more urgently, a deal that would determine whether the company kept its second production line running, or was forced to lay off 60 of its remaining employees. Charlotte had spent months courting the client, flying to their headquarters twice, absorbing their engineers' skepticism about a company that had just changed leadership. And she knew, with the particular clarity of someone who has run the numbers too many times, that this contract was not one failure among many she could absorb. It was the failure that would define whether she kept the company her father built or became the person who lost it. Standing between these two lives, without either of them knowing it yet, was Aaron Cole, the company's operations director, a man in his mid-40s with a talent for sounding reasonable in every meeting, and a habit of taking credit for other people's diligence that had gone unnoticed for years because he was, by all appearances, good at his job. Cole had been the one to recommend outsourcing part of the maintenance schedule the year before, a decision buried in a budget memo that Charlotte had approved without reading closely, trusting Cole's judgment the way she trusted most of the people her father had hired before her. Ben had flagged the recommendation in writing at the time, quietly, through the proper channel, noting that a piece of load-bearing equipment on line 2 was overdue for inspection under the outsourced schedule, and that the gap in coverage was a real risk. Cole had filed the email away and never forwarded it. Nobody but Ben knew that warning existed. Nobody but Ben would remember it. Months later, when it mattered more than anyone could have guessed on that gray Saturday morning at the farmer's market, where a 7-year-old girl reached for a stranger's hand and did not let go. If stories like this one, the quiet ones, about people who get overlooked until somebody finally bothers to look, mean something to you, we're glad you're here watching with us. It's a comfort knowing so many of you have lived some version of this yourselves. Ben had no idea, that morning, walking behind his daughter and his CEO through a market full of strangers who assumed they already knew his story, that the real story was still 11 months from beginning. 11 months earlier, he had not yet learned to notice when his daughter was watching him for permission to be happy again. And that, more than anything else, was about to change. The trouble on line 2 started on a Wednesday in late October, 7 months before the farmer's market, with a grinding sound that the newest technician on the outsourced maintenance crew dismissed as normal wear because nobody had told him otherwise. And by Thursday afternoon, a bearing assembly on the primary conveyor ceased entirely, shutting down production for 6 hours during the exact week Hayes Industrial was hosting the aerospace client's engineering team for a facility walkthrough. Charlotte stood on the production floor in a gray suit that had cost more than most of her employees made in a week, watching $40,000 an hour evaporate, while 3 visiting engineers exchanged glances that told her everything about how this would be reported back to their leadership. Aaron Cole stood beside her, already talking, already explaining, already shaping the story before anyone else could shape it for him. "It's an equipment failure," he said, "not a process failure. These things happen with aging infrastructure. It's not a reflection of our operational discipline." And Charlotte, exhausted and frightened in the specific way that comes from watching your father's life's work wobble in front of strangers, believed him, because believing him was easier than looking for another explanation. Ben was the one who found the bearing assembly first, actually, 20 minutes before the official incident report was filed, and he recognized it immediately for what it was. Not aging infrastructure, but a documented gap in the outsourced inspection schedule. The exact gap he had flagged in writing almost a year earlier. He said as much quietly to the shift supervisor, who said as much more loudly to Cole, who stood in the doorway of his office and looked at Ben the way a man looks at an inconvenient fact he has already decided not to believe. "That's not what happened here," Cole said, his voice even, reasonable, the voice of a man who has never once had to raise it to get his way. "I don't have a record of any such email, and frankly, Ben, I'd think carefully before you start telling a story that puts the blame somewhere other than where it actually belongs." Ben did not raise his voice either. He never did. He said only that he had sent it, that it existed, and that he could find it again if anyone asked him to, and then he went back to his post, because arguing further would have meant risking the job that kept his daughter fed and clothed and picked up from school by 4:30. And he had promised himself, the day Diane died, that he would never again let his own pride cost Rosie anything. The real cost came 3 weeks later, in a small windowless conference room, when Charlotte, acting on Cole's recommendation and the board's mounting pressure to show decisive leadership after the incident, signed off on a restructuring of the maintenance department that eliminated Ben's supervisory position and folded his responsibilities into the outsourced contractor's scope. She did not fire him personally. She did not even know his name at the time. Not really. Not the way you know someone's name when you've looked at their face and understood what it costs them to hear certain words. A human resources coordinator delivered the news in 12 minutes, using phrases like restructuring for efficiency and we truly appreciate your years of service. And Ben sat across the table with his hands folded and his face perfectly still, the same stillness he had worn at Diane's funeral. The stillness of a man who's learned that showing the true size of his feelings only makes them heavier to carry afterward. He was offered a lesser position, a floor technician role at reduced pay with no direct reports, and he took it because a lesser job was still a job, and a job was still the thing standing between Rosie and a version of childhood he refused to let her have. Nobody at Hayes Industrial ever learned that the man reduced to fixing loading dock doors on the night shift was the same man whose written warning, if anyone had bothered to read it, would have prevented the very failure used to justify his demotion. Charlotte signed the restructuring memo between 2 other meetings and did not think about it again for months. Aaron Cole, for his part, felt the particular relief of a man who believes a problem has been quietly and permanently buried. If you've ever been the one who saw something coming and said so, only to be told you were wrong, and then watched it happen anyway with nobody remembering you'd warned them. We'd love to hear about it in the comments, because you are absolutely not the only one who's lived through that particular kind of quiet. 8 months would pass before any of it surfaced again. 8 months in which Ben Turner learned to live smaller and quieter, and further from anyone who might ask him a question he didn't want to answer. And it was in the middle of that shrinking, on an ordinary Saturday he almost didn't go to, that his daughter reached out and grabbed a stranger's hand. The first time Charlotte Hayes noticed Ben Turner as a person rather than a line item on an org chart was 3 weeks after the farmers' market, at a community fall festival held in the same downtown park where the market set up its stalls every Saturday. She had not planned to attend. A colleague had mentioned it in passing, and Charlotte, restless in the particular way people get when a hollowness they've been outrunning finally catches up to them, decided on a whim to go alone. She found Rosie first, spinning in circles near a face-painting booth with a butterfly badly smudged across one cheek, and when the little girl spotted her, she came running with the same unguarded certainty she'd shown at the market, calling Charlotte's name like they were old friends, which, in Rosie's uncomplicated way of understanding the world, they already were. Ben arrived a moment later, out of breath, apologizing for his daughter's enthusiasm, and Charlotte found herself waving off the apology and asking Rosie about the butterfly instead, crouching down to her level in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar and entirely right. It was not, Charlotte told herself afterward, and then again after the next unplanned encounter, and then again after the one after that, a coincidence that she kept appearing at the same library reading hour, the same park cleanup day, the same small community events that Ben and Rosie also attended. She simply found that she wanted to be where they were, in a way that had nothing to do with efficiency or strategy or any of the frameworks she used to organize the rest of her life. Watching Rosie carefully sound out words during story hour, watching Ben's face soften into something almost boyish when his daughter did something small and clever, gave Charlotte a version of peace she had not experienced since before her father's stroke, and she was honest enough with herself, in private, to admit that she was choosing this, again and again, on purpose. The crack in the story Aaron Cole had built began the same month, when Diane Ferris, no relation to Ben's late wife, a coincidence of surnames that Charlotte noted only briefly. The young financial analyst, who had processed the maintenance department's budget the year before, mentioned to Charlotte over a late night reviewing year-end numbers that she'd found something odd while archiving old departmental emails. A flagged safety concern from Ben Turner, dated nearly a year before the Line 2 failure, sitting untouched in a folder Cole had never forwarded to anyone. Diane hadn't thought much of it at the time she filed it. but the date caught her eye against the incident report timeline. And she mentioned it to Charlotte, the way you mentioned something faintly strange, not yet understanding its weight. Charlotte sat very still after Diane left the office that night, staring at a printed copy of an email that flatly contradicted everything Aaron Cole had told her 8 months earlier, and felt something in her chest go cold and then, a moment later, go hot with a fury she had not let herself feel in longer than she could remember. She did not confront Cole immediately. She was too careful, too aware of how thin the ice under her own leadership still felt, to move on an instinct alone, and so she spent the following weeks quietly gathering more, cross-referencing maintenance logs, pulling the outsourced contractor's inspection records, building a picture that made her sicker with every new document. She also, in that same stretch of time, sought Ben out directly for the first time outside of a chance community encounter, finding him one evening at the loading dock where he now worked, standing in the cold with a socket wrench and the particular patience of a man who has stopped expecting things to get better, and has simply decided to keep going anyway. She offered him, clumsily, the only thing she knew how to offer, his old position back, a formal apology, back pay for the demotion, and Ben, setting down the wrench, told her the one thing he actually wanted, which was not any of those things. He wanted the truth told plainly, to the people who needed to hear it, not because he needed the credit, but because somewhere out there was another employee who would flag a real problem someday and deserved to be believed the first time. Charlotte stood in the cold dock air and understood for the first time in 2 years. That dignity was not a line item either. The secondary crisis arrived faster than either of them expected. The aerospace client, still finalizing due diligence on the $40 million contract, requested a full audit of Hayes Industrial's maintenance and safety protocols following the Line 2 incident, an audit that would either validate Cole's version of events or expose it, and would either way determine whether the contract survived at all. Charlotte now held, in a locked drawer in her office, the one piece of evidence that could unravel Cole's story completely, and also threaten to unravel the very deal her company's survival depended on, depending on how, and to whom, she chose to reveal it. 1 month later, an ordinary Thursday afternoon would force her hand in a way neither she nor Ben had said out loud they were dreading. The audit team arrived on a Thursday in early spring, 4 external inspectors in matching windbreakers, moving through the facility with clipboards and a level of scrutiny that made even the confident employees nervous. And Aaron Cole met them at the door with the same easy, reasonable manner he brought to every crisis, already prepared to walk them through a version of events that placed the Line 2 failure squarely on aging equipment and nothing else. What Cole did not know was that Charlotte had, the night before, personally reviewed every maintenance log from the past 18 months, alongside the outsourced contractor's actual inspection schedule, cross-referencing timestamps with a precision she had once reserved only for contract negotiations, and had found not one gap but 3. 3 documented instances where scheduled inspections had simply never occurred, each one falling exactly within the window Ben had flagged as a risk the year before. She brought Ben into the audit not as a courtesy but as a necessity, because he was the only person who could speak, with total specificity, to exactly what the outsourced schedule had missed and why it mattered. He walked the inspectors through the conveyor system with the quiet, exact competence of a man who had spent 15 years learning every bolt and belt tension in that building, naming load tolerances and inspection intervals, and the specific torque specifications on the bearing housing that had failed, never raising his voice, never once mentioning that he had warned about this exact failure a year before it happened. He didn't need to mention it. The lead inspector, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Yoon, pulled the original email herself from the file Diane Ferris had flagged, read it twice, and looked up at Cole with an expression that made the room go very quiet. "This is dated 14 months before the incident," she said, "and it describes, nearly word for word, the exact failure mode we're now investigating. Can you explain why this was never escalated?" Cole's composure, for the first time in 2 years, cracked visibly. He began speaking quickly, defensively, blaming email volume, blaming an overloaded inbox, blaming Ben himself for not following up more forcefully, and with every sentence he dug the hole he was standing in a little deeper, Because Patricia Yoon had already cross-referenced 3 other departmental complaints against his name over the previous 2 years. Patterns of dismissed concerns that had simply never been forwarded upward. Charlotte watched the man her father had trusted for over a decade unravel in real time, watched him reach for excuses the way a drowning man reaches for anything floating nearby, and felt none of the satisfaction she might once have expected. She felt only a tired, clarifying grief for the 2 years she had spent trusting the wrong instincts, and a fierce, protective anger on behalf of the quiet man standing beside her who had never once, in all that time, tried to make himself the center of the story. The company's counsel recommended Cole's immediate suspension pending a full internal review. Within 6 weeks, he would resign rather than face the outcome of that review. And the aerospace client, initially rattled by the audit's findings, would ultimately be reassured, not shaken, by how transparently and thoroughly Hayes Industrial had investigated and corrected its own failure, a response their own engineers noted was rarer and more valuable than a company with no failures to report at all. None of that resolution had happened yet, though. On the Thursday, the audit team left the building with their findings in hand, and Charlotte stood alone with Ben in the sudden quiet of the empty production floor, both of them still absorbing what had just been confirmed in front of witnesses neither of them controlled. She looked at him and said the only thing that felt true in that moment, that she was sorry, plainly, without qualification, for 2 years of not looking closely enough at the people actually holding the place together. Ben, who had spent those same 2 years learning to expect very little from the people above him, found he did not know what to do with an apology that asked for nothing in return. 2 weeks later, on a night neither of them had planned for, that uncertainty would finally break open into something neither of them could keep calling simple gratitude. The company-wide meeting where Ben Turner's name was finally spoken aloud in front of every department head at Hayes Industrial took place on a Tuesday morning in the same conference room where he'd once been quietly demoted, though this time the room was full rather than nearly empty, and Charlotte stood at the front of it herself rather than delegating the moment to someone else. She told the story plainly, the flagged warning, the buried email, the failure that had followed exactly the pattern he predicted, the demotion he'd absorbed without ever once trying to clear his name at anyone else's expense. She reinstated his former position with full back pay, restructured the reporting line so that safety concerns from any technician went directly to a director-level review rather than through a single gatekeeper, and named the new policy, at Ben's quiet request rather than her own suggestion, simply as a standard escalation protocol, rather than anything bearing his name. When she offered him, afterward, the chance to have his old title upgraded further, a nicer office, a public commendation at the next board meeting, Ben declined all of it with the same stillness he brought to everything, and asked instead for something smaller and, to Charlotte, far more moving. A standing budget line, however modest, for cross-training junior technicians on the exact kind of inspection gap that had cost the company so much, so that no one after him would spend a year being disbelieved about something they'd seen clearly and said plainly. The quiet coda came months later, on a Saturday morning that looked almost exactly like the one that had started all of it, except this time Charlotte arrived at the farmer's market, not by careful, unspoken design, but simply because it was where her family went on Saturdays now, and nobody watching the 3 of them move between the honey stall and the bread table mistook the shape of what they were. Rosie, older by a season, had gotten considerably better at baking since the afternoon. Charlotte first stood beside her at the kitchen counter and gently talked her through a batch of cookies that had come out of the oven, black and smoking. The 2 of them laughing so hard over the ruined tray that Ben, watching from the doorway, had felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in 3 years. Not because the cookies were saved, they weren't, but because his daughter was being taught, patiently and without any hurry, by someone who clearly wanted nothing more in that moment than to be exactly there. He kept still on the windowsill above his kitchen sink, one perfectly ordinary river stone Rosie had painted with a small, lopsided butterfly the same fall. Charlotte first crouched down to admire the smudged one on her cheek, a small physical thing that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to him. The exact moment he'd stopped being only Rosie's father and started, slowly, letting himself become someone's partner again too. Standing at the market that final Saturday, watching Rosie run ahead toward the honey stall the way she always did, Charlotte slipped her hand into Ben's, not for anyone else's benefit, and said, low enough that only he could hear it, that she was glad, in the end, that people had thought exactly what they'd thought that first morning. Ben didn't laugh this time, and didn't deflect it either. He only nodded, and held on. If there's someone in your own life who was quietly misjudged before anyone bothered to really see them, a coworker written off too fast, a neighbor people kept their distance from without ever asking why, a parent or a friend who went quiet after a loss and got mistaken for someone who didn't want to be found. We'd genuinely love to hear about them in the comments, even if it's only to finally say, out loud, that they deserved better than what they got. Being underestimated doesn't mean being small. It often just means nobody has taken the time yet to notice what you're actually carrying and what you're actually capable of. If stories like Ben and Charlotte's mean something to you, we hope you'll stay close and keep watching with us. There's always another quiet, overlooked person whose story is still waiting to be told properly, and we'd love for you to be here for it.